Today we are going to be talking about the sideboard, one of the key aspects of Magic, but often one of the most neglected. And we're going to be going through the topic with the aid of this incredible article by Reid Duke, one of the best to ever play the game. He's a Pro Tour champion. He is beloved by many. He has done quite well in World Championships. He's in the Magic the Gathering Hall of Fame. Everybody loves Reid Duke, and he is a great writer and a great player. So we're going to be going through his article as we talk about the sideboard, and we're going to be explaining his examples and making sure I clarify everything as I can do while we read through it. Let's get started. The sideboard from 2015, so a little bit of an older article. Hopefully I'm able to expose this to a new audience because it's a great one. It's easy to explain, even to someone unfamiliar with the game, that a Magic deck consists of 60 cards with a limit of no more than 4 copies of any particular card, except for basic lands, of course. It's a bit more challenging to teach them about the extra 15 cards that come along with, yet are not part of, the deck. Harder still is the task of conveying just how important those cards are, and how vital it is to choose them carefully. Tournament matches are typically determined by a best 2 out of 3 set of games. For the first game, both players play with their main decks, their primary 60 cards, that will be the same for the start of every match. After game 1, the players have the option to swap in any number of the 15 cards from their sideboard in an effort to tailor their deck toward winning the next game. Technically speaking, it's legal to play with a deck of more than 60 cards, but at all times, your deck must be at least 60 cards, and your sideboard must be at most 15 cards, except in limited, but we can maybe cover the sideboarding in limited article separately. Sideboards win tournaments. This is the key. This is like why I want to cover this article, because I do think that sideboards are really important, but often neglected, especially because a lot of Magic content these days is based around best of one on Magic Arena. So sideboarding is really important, especially if you want to do well at FNM, local tournaments, all sorts of things like that. Because your sideboard cards can be more specialized, pinpoint focused for a certain task or matchup, they're often your most powerful tools. Sometimes sideboarding can be the most important factor in determining how 2 decks will match up against one another. Building and using your sideboard well will be crucial to your tournament success. Let's go over a few of the useful things your sideboard can do for you. Just before I get to that though, I do want to say that there are some decks where sideboarding is incredibly important, where it will be like, oh, you're always a little bit of an underdog in game 1, and in games 2 and 3, because of your sideboard tools, you can actually become a favorite in the matchup. And those sorts of decks really, really reward sideboarding, where you have specific tools to help you fight maybe certain unfair decks that you might normally be bad against. And sideboarding can actually be like really, really key. So in like big Pro Tour tournaments, in the top 8, the top 8 is often played best 3 out of 5. And the first 2 games are non-sideboarded. And then sometimes a player will lose the first 2 games and then sweep the next 3 because sideboarding makes such a huge difference. Okay, answering problems. You sideboard with the goal of making your deck better suited for a matchup. What simpler way is there to accomplish that goal than to bring in the perfect answers for your opponent's threats? A classic example of a sideboard card is one that destroys artifacts and or enchantments. Except in extreme circumstances, players choose not to main deck cards like Smash to Smithereens, which is a destroy artifact effect that deals damage to the artifact controller, out of fear that those cards will be dead, useless against certain opponents. However, it is nice to have access to Smash to Smithereens in your sideboard when you face a deck that's particularly reliant on artifacts, like the one featured toward the end of this article. He covers a Ensoul artifact deck that cares about beefing up artifacts into giant creatures. Similarly, if your opponent has lots of enchantments, you might want to sideboard in more answers to enchantments. If your opponent is trying to win via a swarm of cheap creatures, you might want to board in a sweeper like Languish, which is -4/-4 to all creatures. And this is a funny artwork of it. The original artwork had a crocodile with the kind of like purple mist around it, so that's the art I always recognize. If he or she has a particularly devastating spell, perhaps Negate is your best bet. So he says spell, he means non-creature spell. That's oftentimes Magic parlance as well. So technically casting a creature is still casting a creature spell, but when someone says spell, then they mean usually a non-creature spell like an instant or a sorcery. So that's just good to know as well. So yeah, these are like the narrow hate cards like artifact removal, enchantment removal / artifact removal, counter spells that counter anything, board sweepers for certain decks. Your sideboard lets you find the perfect tool for any job. Playing game 1 ought to show you exactly what the job is in the case at hand. Okay, so case number 1, answering problems. Case number 2, adding threats. On the flip side, you can also use your sideboard to find a new threat that your opponent will, hopefully, struggle with. You might go about this in a number of different ways. First, you might simply add more threats in an attempt to overload your opponent's answers. Imagine, for example, that you face a control deck that features very few creatures. During sideboarding, you get to take out some of your ineffective creature removal and increase your concentration of threats, which ought to be tremendously helpful. That's a big benefit for control decks, is that they blank opponent's removal in game one, and that gives you an advantage in long games because they'll draw removal spells that are then useless. Alternatively, you might just want to make some upgrades to your existing threats. Against the deck with board sweepers, a creature like Hangerback Walker, which when it dies makes a bunch of Thopters, can give you a bit more resilience. A Goblins deck might be interested in Subterranean Scout, which is probably not a card you'd want to play in Constructed, but you can make it so something can't block. Against a deck full of annoying blockers. Sideboarding is about perfecting your deck for the matchup, and a few minor upgrades can be a big part of that. Most often, though, you'll sideboard with the goal of diversifying your threats. It's all about sticking a threat that your opponent cannot effectively answer, and the more angles you can attack from, the better chance you have of doing so. One exciting new sideboard card for red decks is Molten Vortex, which is a way to discard lands to do damage. It never really saw play, though. Control decks will try to shut you down by killing off your creatures and countering your burn spells. That said, there's not a lot they can do to overcome the slow bleed from a Molten Vortex in a protracted game. Oftentimes, this role that Molten Vortex was fulfilling in this sort of format back then is now fulfilled by something like a Planeswalker, where if you stick a Planeswalker, your opponent might not have removal that matches up well against a Planeswalker. They might have things that kills creatures or things that can counter a Planeswalker, but like, oh, maybe I stick a Planeswalker in play and start getting some value that way. In general, look for Planeswalkers and other non-creature threats as excellent sideboard cards against slow decks. So yeah, pretty much he emphasizes it there as well, but Molten Vortex is not always the prime example. One of the things that I like that makes this a good example is the fact that it costs 1 mana, so you can sometimes sneak it in on turn 1. And so if you have access to cards like that, they can be good. Okay, so as just to recap, we have answering problems and we have adding threats. Hate cards. This is a big category for sideboarding. Answering problems and adding threats are examples of versatile ways to use your sideboard slots. Over the course of a long tournament, you're likely to turn to these cards often, as they'll serve as minor upgrades in a lot of matchups. However, another approach is to look for hate cards, single cards that are extremely effective at hating out, a particular deck, color, or strategy. With Orbs of Warding, for example, so giving you hexproof and then making it so that creatures deal less damage to you, decks with heavy with burn spells will hardly be able to touch you because they can't target you have hexproof. Gaia's Revenge is a nightmare for blue control decks, hoping to sit back on permission spells and removal because it can't be countered and can't be the target of non-green spells or abilities from non-green sources, so it's really hard for them to target it. And then Tragic Arrogance can utterly demolish a creature ramp deck like Green Devotion. So if you have a bunch of mana dorks in play, having them like only have their smallest one, because you get to choose which one they keep, can be effective. Or just really any sweeper is like good against those sorts of decks. A rule of thumb is that the more extreme a strategy is, the easier it will be to sideboard against. You can hamstring a small creature deck with a cheap board sweeper like Languish, which we already covered. You can shut down a combination deck. I don't know why he doesn't just say combo deck, because everyone calls them that, but a combination deck by knocking out one of their pieces before they can properly set things up. Anytime you find yourself with extra space in your sideboard, identifying and playing with hate cards against a popular deck is a great way to improve your chances in a tournament. You might not use them quite as often as your versatile sideboard cards, but sometimes they can swing a matchup in your favor at the low cost of only a sideboard slot or two. One example of this that comes up all of the time is graveyard decks, because graveyard hate can turn a graveyard matchup from one that's like, oh, I have no interaction for what they're doing, to one where you completely shut them down and make a lot of their cards useless. So graveyard decks oftentimes really have to adapt how they play in post-board matchups, where they know that you're bringing in some graveyard hate, and so they change the way their strategy works as a result. And that's kind of a next level sideboarding thing, where a graveyard deck will have to add threats that sometimes aren't manipulated by the graveyard. An example of this that comes to mind is, if you've played any Pioneer, is Arc-like Phoenix can rely on its graveyard pretty heavily, and so it'll bring in the card Enigma Drake, which is a 4-mana creature that can be a large threat even if your graveyard is exiled. So that's the sort of thing that you can do in response to these sorts of hate cards, but does not mean that hate cards aren't still important, because hate yards to be good against the graveyard, such as Leyline of the Void or things like that, can still be really important in certain matchups. Transform sideboards. Another category. The most interesting thing about sideboarding is that it's done in secret. Most of the time, your opponent won't even know what cards are in your sideboard, let alone which ones you'll choose to bring in for game 2. This means that every once in a while, you'll have the chance to take an opponent by surprise, employing a strategy he or she hadn't expected or prepared for. A simple example would be a control deck with very few creatures in the main deck. If your opponent sideboards out a lot of his or her creature removal while you sideboard in a number of threatening creatures, like Jace Vryn's Prodigy, which flips into a Planeswalker, or Hangerback Walker, which we've already looked at, is a card that just like kind of growing threat, you might be able to steal an easy win. On the other hand, a seemingly aggressive Jeskai deck might transform into a more controlling deck by sideboarding in End Hostilities, just a sweeper, Elspeth Sun's Champion, a huge planeswalker finisher, and Dig Through Time, which is just a card advantage spell. So just think of those in those buckets so that this is relevant to your modern gameplay. So like, oh, your deck that looks aggressive maybe has a plan against other aggressive decks where it sideboards into more of a controlling role. An opponent who goes overboard with creature removal and life gain can be easily outdone in the late game. Transform sideboards can be fun and impressive when they work out, but I recommend turning to them only as a Hail Mary when nothing else is working. After all, sideboarding should be about perfecting your deck, not about clumsily trying to employ two conflicting strategies at the same time. Reid Duke mentions this in other articles that he writes about his gameplay philosophy, where he really doesn't like transformative sideboards because it ends up making it so you don't have room for these high impact hate cards, you don't have room for these extra threats, you don't have room for answering problems because you're filling your sideboard with a transformative plan that just leaves you with pre-board games where you're playing like your normal deck game one, and then sideboarded games where you're playing like a watered down version of a different deck. And so that's not something he enjoys as much. So he doesn't really like the transformative sideboard plan, but sometimes it's like something you can do with specific decks. How to build your sideboard. Building your sideboard is a task that's as challenging and as important as building your main deck. From my experience though, it's typically given only a small fraction of the attention it deserves. The elephant method. This is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this article, because this is one of the most important concepts when building a Magic deck. The elephant method. It can be quite difficult to hone in on the perfect 15 cards. One way to start the process is to employ the elephant method. Legendary deck builder and Pro Tour Hall of Famer Zwei Mauschewitz, I can't say his name, it's Zwei Mauschewitz. He's a very famous player, especially for his deck building prowess. Explains the elephant method as writing out ideal realistic lists for all matchups and then trying to make the unique cards in those lists add up to 75 cards before deciding on the specific 60 for the main deck and the specific 15 for the sideboard. When you employ the elephant method, you're thinking of your deck as a complete 75 card unit. First, you consider what you'd like your deck to look like after sideboarding in each of the matchups you expect to face. Next, you make sure you have the proper number of cards to bring in and take out in each matchup. Finally, you construct your deck and sideboard accordingly. In short, you look at the big picture, and your sideboard is as important to the big picture as your main deck is. So this idea of not starting with your 60 card deck and then adding sideboard slots, but starting with a full 75 card list of what you want to have access to against the entire field. It's much harder to do this, but it does really, really help, because then you start out kind of with your sideboard plans in place because you've built your sideboard with that in mind. Like, okay, this is the ideal way my deck would be configured against the premier control deck of the format. This is how it'd be configured against the premier aggro deck of the format. This is how it'd be against the premier combo deck or the premier most popular deck, which you can like think about how your deck matches up against all these different things and then build like your ideal main deck for each of those situations and then see how much overlap there is and how you can build your sideboard. Don't over sideboard. One common pitfall to avoid is over sideboarding. It's dangerous to bring in so many sideboard cards that you compromise the original game plan of your deck. In sideboarding, continue to pay close attention to your creature count, your mana curve, and other important details of your deck's composition. For example, if you're playing an aggro deck, you might encounter a problem if you swap out 6 creatures for 6 answer cards. You're liable to lose too much of the aggressive potential that made you choose the deck in the first place. This is a really important point. You don't want to side in too many cards because it ends up just making it so that your deck is non-functional and you just lose the game, because even when you draw all of the sideboard cards you wanted. And so this is a really important point. Similarly, if you're playing a control deck against a fast aggro deck, you might be unimpressed by a card drawing spell like Reid the Bones, especially since it causes you to lose life, scry 2, draw 2, lose 2. To be sure, Reid the Bones is not one of the best cards in the matchup, but you need to maintain a certain density of powerful late game cards, or else you might no longer be able to win. Many times I've made the mistake of sideboarding in too many cheap removal spells, only to find myself suffering from mana flood and losing the long games that my deck has been originally designed to win. It's possible that Reid the Bones is so important to your overall structure that you should leave it in even against an opponent who's attacking your life total. Now he goes into a bit of an example, and I'm going to go through this section a bit faster, but what he basically talks about is Blue-Red and Soul Artifacts, which is an aggressive deck that was played by Mike Sigrist, who's a really good player as well. He was a player of the year and all sorts of good things. But basically what he's talking about is a synergy aggressive deck. And then he talks about how he's got very specific sideboard card answers like Roast, which is a kill spell, or he's got Thopter Spy Networks as a like recurring value engine. But basically he had to balance that by not shaving too many cards in any particular matchup because his deck is a synergy aggressive deck. And so that's kind of the gist of that whole section. You can read it. I'll link the article in the description. Practice with sideboards. Here's the final thing. Sometimes the way 2 decks match up after sideboarding has virtually no resemblance to the way they match up in game 1. When this is the case, you want to know about it ahead of time instead of facing a trial by fire in the actual tournament. So this is if you're getting ready for a big tournament. where you have like a testing team or a buddy you can practice with. Like most things in Magic, there's no secret recipe to building a perfect sideboard. The key is simply to give it the attention it deserves rather than throwing it together the morning of the tournament. Personally, in the late stages of my tournament preparation, I like to be playing virtually all of my practice games with sideboards. Because remember, in a best of 3 game match, you're going to be playing more games with sideboards than you are going to be playing game ones. Because if you think about it, you're playing one game one guaranteed, but then you're playing 1 or 2 sideboarded games. So at the very least, you're playing the same number of sideboarded games as main deck games, but you always have that option for that game 3, which is sideboarded. So you're going to be playing way more games with sideboards, so it makes sense to practice games with sideboards when you can. In preparing for a tournament, if you aren't playing any sideboarded games or are doing so only as an afterthought, I recommend rethinking your process to give your sideboard some extra emphasis. A little bit of work on your sideboard will pay off in a big way. So basically the gist of this is make sure that you have a sideboard that you spend a lot of time building, because it's really important to do well in big tournaments. A lot of the times that's like one of the keys in Constructed, is making sure you have a sideboard that is good for the meta that you expect to face. And then when you're building your sideboard, you can do the answering problems technique with more generic answers, adding threats if your deck is the sort of one that needs to diversify its threats, and then having some hate cards, and then potentially doing transformative if you don't have any other plans for a particular matchup. And then of course the elephant method is really, really cool. That is going to do it for this video though. If you did make it all the way till the end of the video, leave hashtag the sideboard in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video. Let me know if you'd like to see more of these article breakdowns in the future, but that's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Shout out to Reid Duke again for writing such a great article, and I will talk to you next time.